I'd photographed plenty of abandoned places before, but the old orphanage in Scotland had an atmosphere that set it apart from the rest. The building loomed out of the mist as I arrived, its crumbling walls and boarded-up windows giving off a sense of foreboding. It felt as if the place was waiting for me, holding its breath, hiding secrets within its decaying walls. My camera hung heavy around my neck, ready to capture the eerie beauty of the orphanage before it was lost to time. As I stepped inside, the silence was immediate and overwhelming. No creaking floorboards, no distant traffic, just a deep, oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow every sound. I wandered through the hallways, each step kicking up dust that floated like ghosts in the pale light filtering through broken windows. The orphanage felt like a time capsule, trapped in a past it couldn't escape from. I focused on my work, framing shots of the decaying rooms, the peeling wallpaper, the forgotten toys scattered on the floor. But as I moved deeper into the building, I began to hear faint giggles and whispers, barely audible, like the distant echoes of children playing. I paused, straining to listen, but the sounds faded into the silence. Just the wind, I told myself, shaking off the unease that had started to creep in. This place was playing tricks on me, and I couldn't let it get under my skin. Not yet. As I moved down a particularly shadowy corridor, the light from my camera's flash barely cutting through the gloom, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. I turned, heart skipping a beat, and saw two children standing just a few feet away. A boy and a girl, both with pale skin and dark hair, their eyes wide and unblinking. They couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. I hadn't heard them approach, and their sudden appearance startled me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice echoing unnaturally in the empty hallway. "We live here," the girl replied, her voice soft and melodic, yet strangely detached. "We were forgotten when everyone left. The others went away," the boy added, his tone matching his sister's. "But we stayed." They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd expect to see in black and white photos from decades ago. Their outfits, combined with their unsettlingly calm demeanor, sent a shiver down my spine. But I pushed the feeling aside, reminding myself they were just kids. Abandoned, forgotten, it was heartbreaking. "I'm here to take pictures of the place before it's torn down," I explained, trying to keep my voice gentle. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The twins exchanged a glance, then smiled. Innocent smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. "We've been waiting for someone to come," the girl said, "to help us." But something about the way she said it, the way they both looked at me, made my skin prickle. Their speech was formal, almost archaic, like they were speaking from another time. And then there were the things they started to say, little comments that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You're here all alone, aren't you, Nico?" the boy asked, tilting his head slightly. I hadn't told them my name. My grip on the camera tightened as unease settled in. The longer I stood there, the more I noticed the off-kilter details. Their clothes too pristine for a place this run down. The way their shadows didn't quite match their movements. My initial sympathy began to erode, replaced by a creeping dread. Something wasn't right about these children, and the more I spoke with them, the more I felt like I was stepping into a trap. The more time I spent with the twins, the more my unease deepened. They insisted on showing me around, leading me through the orphanage's winding halls and dilapidated rooms. But with each step, the atmosphere grew colder, the shadows thicker and more oppressive, as if the building itself was closing in on me. The twins no longer seemed like innocent children lost in time. There was something sinister lurking beneath their calm expressions. They began to ask strange, unsettling questions, their voices echoing in the empty halls. "Do you remember the time you fell from your bike, Nico?" the girl asked with a sly smile. "The scar on your knee, it still aches when it rains, doesn't it?" My heart skipped a beat. I had never told anyone about that. Not since I was a kid. The memory was buried deep, something I hadn't thought about in years. Yet here these children were, bringing it up as casually as if they'd been there to witness it. "Who told you that?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a fear I couldn't hide. The boy giggled, a sound that echoed eerily in the decaying corridor. "We know lots of things, Nico. We know about the nightmares you had as a child, the ones with the dark room and the whispers." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The nightmares, they were something I'd never spoken of, not even to my closest friends. The twins started to play twisted games, taunting me with riddles that hinted at dark secrets from my past, leading me in circles through the building as if they were toying with me. Every turn brought me back to the same spot, the same cold, darkened room. Panic began to set in as I realized that the layout of the orphanage had changed. The doors I had entered through were gone, replaced by solid walls, and no matter which way I turned, I couldn't find an exit. The twins' laughter grew more sinister, their eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. They weren't children, they were something far older, far darker, and they had been waiting for someone like me. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I was trapped, and they were feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every moment I stayed in their presence. Desperation clawed at me as I faced the twins in the center of the orphanage's decaying hall. "Let me go!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. But instead of answering, they simply smiled, those innocent faces twisting into something far more sinister. Their skin began to pale, becoming almost translucent, their eyes darkening into empty voids. The shadows around them grew thicker, more tangible, as they revealed their true forms. Ghostly, malevolent spirits who had been toying with me all along. As the twins transformed, the entire orphanage seemed to awaken with a terrible, unnatural life. The air filled with the cold, hollow laughter of other children, dozens of them, emerging from the walls and the darkness. These were the souls of those who had fallen victim to the twins' game, and now they surrounded me, cutting off any chance of escape. "We feed on the souls of those who enter our home," the girl said, her voice now a chilling whisper that echoed through the hall. "You're ours now, Nico," the boy added, his grin widening as he stepped closer. I tried to run, to push through the crowd of ghostly children, but they swarmed me, their icy hands pulling me down, their hollow eyes watching with a hunger that terrified me to my core. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the orphanage's cold, oppressive darkness. As I was dragged into the suffocating mass of spirits, the last thing I saw was the twins, watching with malevolent glee, their laughter ringing in my ears as everything faded to black.
We had just settled into our new life in the old farmhouse, the kind of place where the air felt cleaner and the world seemed to slow down. Tom and I were excited for Sophie to grow up with wide open spaces and the peace of the countryside. But our idyllic start took a strange turn when Sophie came running out of the woods one afternoon, holding the hand of a little girl. "This is Grace," Sophie said, her voice breathless with excitement. "She's lost." The girl standing next to her was small, with pale skin and dark hair that hung limply around her face. Her clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a black-and-white photo. She didn't say much, just nodded when I asked if she was okay. Her eyes, though, were deep and unreadable, staring up at me with an intensity that made me feel uneasy. Still, the thought of a lost child tugged at my heart. I couldn't just leave her out there alone. "Let's get you inside," I said, offering a gentle smile. "We'll call someone to help you find your way home." Grace didn't resist. She followed us back to the farmhouse without a word, her small hand cold in mine. There was something about her quietness that felt off, but I brushed it aside, telling myself she was just scared. I put her in Sophie's room for the night, promising to figure things out in the morning. As I watched her settle in, I felt a strange, inexplicable urge to protect her, even as a sliver of doubt gnawed at the back of my mind. That night, after tucking Sophie and Grace into bed, I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me. Tom and I sat in the living room, the farmhouse quiet except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. It wasn't until later, as I was getting ready for bed, that I noticed something strange. Sophie's toys, which I had put away earlier, were scattered across the hallway floor in odd, almost deliberate patterns. Puzzled, I picked them up and put them back in her room, thinking maybe Sophie had gotten up and played with them before falling asleep again. But then, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. I stepped out of the bedroom, expecting to see Tom or Sophie, but the hall was empty. The air felt wrong, colder than it should have been, with a heavy, oppressive chill that clung to my skin. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind or the old house settling, but the feeling of being watched lingered. In the middle of the night, Sophie's screams shattered the silence. I rushed to her room, my heart pounding in my chest. She was sitting up in bed, trembling, her face pale. "The bad girl," she whispered, her voice shaking. "She wants to hurt me." I held her close, trying to calm her, but my mind was racing. As I comforted Sophie, I glanced over at Grace, who was lying in the other bed, seemingly asleep. But something about her was wrong. Even with her eyes closed, she felt too still, too quiet. And when I looked closer, I saw it. Her eyes, though shut, seemed to twitch, as if she was watching me from behind her lids. The next morning, Tom noticed it too. The cold spots, the odd noises, the feeling that something was moving around the house when it shouldn't be. He had dismissed my concerns at first, but now he was starting to experience it himself. We both knew then that something was terribly wrong. Grace wasn't just a lost child, there was something far darker at play, and it was beginning to take hold of our home. The strange occurrences in the farmhouse were becoming too much to ignore. Sophie's nightmares were getting worse, and the cold spots were spreading, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Tom and I were at a loss, so I decided to dig into the history of the house, hoping to find some explanation. I spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers and town records, trying to piece together the story of our new home. That's when I found it. An article from over 50 years ago about a little girl named Grace who had gone missing in the woods near our farmhouse. She was never found, her disappearance a mystery that haunted the town for years. The article described her as a quiet, reserved child, much like the Grace we had taken in. My heart sank as I read on, the pieces falling into place with a sickening clarity. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that the Grace in our home wasn't just lost, she wasn't even alive. Determined to confront the truth, I waited until Sophie was asleep and Tom was out of the house. I found Grace sitting quietly in Sophie's room, her dark eyes following me as I entered. "Grace," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who are you really?" She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I told you," she said in that soft, melodic voice that now sent chills down my spine. "I'm lost." "No," I said, stepping closer, my fear giving way to anger. "You're not lost. You've been here for a long time, haven't you? You've been waiting. At that, her demeanor shifted. The innocent facade melted away, replaced by something cold and calculating. Her voice dropped to a low, menacing tone. You're right, she whispered, a wicked smile creeping across her face. I've been waiting for a family like yours. My blood ran cold as she continued, her words laced with malice. I don't plan on leaving, Lily. This is my home now, and Sophie, she's mine. Terror gripped me as I realized the depth of the danger we were in. Grace wasn't just a lost child. She was something far darker, a malevolent spirit that had been waiting for years to claim a family. And now, she had her sights set on Sophie. Panic surged through me as Grace's true nature was revealed. I couldn't let this spirit take Sophie. I had to get her out of our home. You're not welcome here, I shouted, grabbing Grace's arm to drag her out. But the moment I touched her, the air around us grew ice cold. Her form began to shift, twisting into something grotesque and inhuman. Gone was the innocent child. In her place stood a vengeful entity with hollow, black eyes and a face contorted in rage. Before I could react, Grace lashed out with a force that sent me stumbling back. The room filled with a dark energy that made it hard to breathe. I screamed for Tom, but he was already caught in the spirit's wrath, thrown violently across the room as if he weighed nothing. My heart pounded in terror as I watched Grace turn her gaze to Sophie, who had just woken up, confused and frightened. Grace's twisted smile grew as she approached Sophie, and before I could stop her, she reached out, merging with my daughter in a horrifying display of supernatural power. Sophie's eyes rolled back, then snapped open, black as pitch, void of any humanity. A cruel, wicked smile spread across her face, mirroring Grace's. I froze, paralyzed by the sheer horror of what I was witnessing. My daughter was gone, consumed by the darkness that Grace had brought into our lives. My scream echoed through the farmhouse, but it was too late. Sophie was lost to me forever.
I was excited when the moving truck pulled up next door. Our neighborhood was quiet, and I'd been hoping for new neighbors, especially ones with kids. When I saw that they had a son about Ben's age, I couldn't have been more thrilled. Max, they said his name was. He and Ben hit it off immediately, running around the yard together, laughing like they'd been friends for years. Max was a polite, well-behaved boy. He always said please and thank you, and he had this calmness about him that I found refreshing. At first, everything seemed perfect. I was relieved to have such nice neighbors, and I looked forward to getting to know them better. But as the days passed, little things about Max began to nag at me. He rarely blinked, and his skin was almost too pale, like he hadn't seen much sunlight. There was something odd about his gaze, too, something that made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. His eyes would linger just a moment too long, and when he smiled, it never quite reached those unnervingly bright eyes. I tried to push the feeling aside, chalking it up to my imagination. After all, Ben was happy, and that's what mattered. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about Max. Something that didn't quite fit. It didn't take long for my unease about Max to deepen. One evening, as I peeked into the boys' room to check on them, I caught a glimpse of something that sent a chill down my spine. Max's eyes, in the dim light, seemed to glow, a faint, eerie light that I could have sworn wasn't just a trick of my imagination. I blinked, and it was gone, but the image stuck with me, refusing to fade. Then there were the things he said, little comments that didn't make sense at first, like knowing what Tom would say before he said it or predicting that a storm would hit the next day even when the forecast was clear. It was as if Max had some uncanny insight into the future, and each time it happened, it left me with a growing sense of dread. But what really terrified me was the change in Ben. My cheerful, outgoing boy became withdrawn, his usual laughter replaced by a nervous silence. He started avoiding eye contact, especially with Max, and whenever they were alone together, I could see the fear in his eyes. Ben began waking up in the middle of the night, screaming about the bad things Max says, but when I asked him about it, he would only shake his head, too scared to speak. I tried talking to Max's parents, hoping for some explanation, but their responses were always vague, their smiles unsettlingly calm, as if nothing was wrong. But I knew something was terribly off. The initial excitement of new neighbors had morphed into a gnawing fear that I couldn't ignore, and every day, that fear grew stronger. The more I saw Ben withdraw and the more unsettling Max's behavior became, the more desperate I grew for answers. Something was horribly wrong, and I couldn't just sit by and do nothing. I began digging into the history of our neighborhood, hoping to find some clue about the strange family next door. What I found shook me to my core. Decades ago, the house next door had belonged to a family, a husband, wife, and their young son. They had died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths never fully explained. Some said it was an accident, others whispered about something darker, but one thing was certain, their spirits were said to have never moved on, trapped in a limbo between worlds. The more I read, the more the pieces clicked together, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Max and his parents weren't living people at all. They were spirits, cursed to wander the earth, seeking some kind of peace through connections with the living. My heart raced as I confronted them, fear and anger fueling my words. "Who are you? What do you want with my son?" I demanded, my voice trembling but firm. Max's parents exchanged a glance before nodding, their expressions somber. "We are not like you," Max's mother admitted, her voice calm but laced with sadness. "We've been here for a long time, hoping to find peace by being close to the living. But it seems all we bring is fear." The confirmation of my worst fears left me trembling. They hadn't meant to harm us, they claimed, but their presence had brought nothing but terror to our lives. I knew then that this couldn't continue, they had to leave, for Ben's sake, and for mine. My heart pounded as I stood in front of Max and his parents, my resolve firm despite the fear gnawing at me. "You need to leave," I said, my voice steady, though every fiber of my being was trembling. "You can't stay here anymore." Max's parents exchanged a sorrowful glance, their expressions tinged with a deep, ancient sadness. "Please," Max's mother whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. "We only wanted to find peace, to be part of the living world again." But I couldn't let them stay, not after what they'd done to Ben, the terror they'd brought into our lives. "I'm sorry," I replied, choking back my own tears. "But you have to go. You're hurting us." For a moment, they seemed on the verge of pleading again, but then Max stepped forward, his once bright eyes dull with understanding. "We'll leave," he said softly, his gaze lingering on Ben, who was hiding behind me, terrified. "We didn't mean to cause harm." And just like that, they began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air, leaving behind nothing but the echo of their sorrow. The house next door was suddenly, eerily empty, as if they had never been there at all. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, pulling Ben close as I tried to soothe his trembling. We were safe now, but as I held Ben, I couldn't shake the haunting image of Max's sad eyes, the way he had looked at us before disappearing. The spirits were gone, but their presence lingered in our memories, a ghostly imprint that would never fully fade. I knew that while we might move on, we would always be haunted by the memory of our ghostly neighbors, and the unsettling reminder of how close we had come to losing everything.